Bé, hola, bon vespre a totes i benvingudes en aquesta nova sessió del cicle Màtries. És un cicle que organitza la Fundació Mallorca Literària i que enguany hem estrenat la segona edició de Converses, ja fa més temps que se fa, però que se dedica a aquest concepte de Màtries a la segona temporada. Varen començar fa un parell de setmanes a la Fundació, a la Casa Museu Llorenç Villalonga, amb la Gemma Ruiz Palà, xerrant del seu llibre Les nostres mares, i avui tenim una nova sessió d'aquestes converses que sobretot giren al voltant de les mirades que totes aquestes dones, autores contemporànies estan aportant a què significa avui dia habitar aquest món nostre des de perspectives del tot diverses i interessantíssimes. Avui ens acompanyen dues autores que ho han fet també des de perspectives valentes i novedoses, molt originals. Lara Williams, com sabeu, que presenta aquesta novel·la en català L'Odissea, publicada per Angle Editorial, i també Irene Pujadas, ella també autora dels Desperfectes, d'aquest volum de contes, però que a més treballa a Angle Editorial, o sigui, està doblement o triple o múltiplement connectada en la conversa que tindrem avui i serà molt interessant sentir com elles dues, a més, generacionalment també tenen molt de temes en comú i molt de punts i molt de vincles que aniran desgranant a poc, però sempre tenim la tradició de començar aquestes converses amb una mateixa pregunta, que totes les persones que les han protagonitzades intenten respondre cadascuna a la seva manera i que al final de tot podrem fer un recull de totes les respostes perquè realment serà una resposta col·lectiva interessantíssima. I la pregunta és què significa per elles o com definirien aquest concepte de màtria, perquè han batiat el cicle amb una paraula nova, amb una paraula que no existia i amb una paraula que des de la Fundació Mallorca Literària volen reivindicar i, per tant, Irene, Lara, vos demanam quina és la vostra definició o què vos suggereix a què relacioneu aquest concepte de màtria.
Hola, bon vespre. A mi, la idea aquesta de màtria, la imatge que em ve al cap una mica és una mica com si estiguéssim en un bar i hi hagués com licorets bons com per tothom i hi hagués una mena de taula com amb moltes dones vives i mortes, tant dones com del món de les arts, de la literatura, és a dir, com la meva mare i les meves amigues. És a dir, m'imagino una mica com una petita comunitat en què gent de moltes generacions diferents i de moltes geografies diferents, per alguna mena de miracle de l'espai-temps, estan com totes allà i totes ens ajudem una mica les unes a les altres o m'expliquen coses, elles a mi. Sí.
I think when I think about the idea of matriarchy, the idea that springs to mind is thinking about kind of writing and publishing, because women are generally buying more books than men and are kind of unusually overrepresented in publishing. But I think it's quite a complicated subject. It's something that's become a bit controversial in the UK in that there's conversations about how men are kind of underrepresented in publishing, particularly professionally, but those top spots still tend to be occupied by men, whereas the underrepresentation tends to be in the middle and at the bottom. So I think that's what I think of as in terms of matriarchy. I actually think publishing has the potential to be quite a special industry in which women are more kind of represented at those top level positions, and I don't think it's something we should be scared of, and I don't think it's something that needs to be pushed back against. I think that's a really exciting thought.
Bé, dit això, avui estem aquí com per xerrar amb la Lara Williams, especialment per xerrar de la seva obra en general, sobretot de l'Odissea, que és la seva última novel·la, que, bé, jo soc de Barcelona, però aquí a Palma també hi ha gran presència de creuers. Llavors, bé, és una novel·la que se situa dins d'un enorme creuer de luxe, fastuós, excessiu, i segueix la vida tant a mar com a terra ferma de la Ingrid, que és una treballadora impecable, que necessita mantenir una rutina d'ordre extrem perquè la vida no se li descontroli, en certa manera, no? La idea del lloc és molt important, la idea del creuer, i llavors jo volia començar preguntant-li a la Lara Williams per què. Per què vas decidir com basar la teva novel·la en un creuer i què hi havia en aquest espai tan kitsch i tan ple d'espectacle que et semblés interessant?
I think a lot of my kind of initial writing decisions are quite instinctive to begin with, and I'm not always sure why I feel so dead set on an idea, but I felt absolutely set on setting this novel on a cruise, and I wasn't quite sure why to begin with, but then sort of unpacking it afterwards. I'm really interested in place and how characters relate to place, and I really like the idea of a cruise ship as somewhere that's kind of this hyper articulation of place, in which the brightness is really turned up and everything is really kind of highly performative in how it presents as a place. But it's fundamentally placeless. It's this sort of floating blob, and I kind of liked that tension. I'm also interested in the idea of artifice, and there's kind of a Disneyified element to a cruise ship where everything is sort of pretending. I also wanted to write about kind of modern work cultures, and a cruise ship is this sort of like closed off space and this kind of self-contained economy. So that felt like a nice way to sort of explore things that felt quite inescapable to me, like participating in a particular economy, particularly in precarity labour. That felt quite inescapable to me at the time. It felt like there were no other options. So the kind of like claustrophobia of that space felt like an interesting thing to explore some of these themes.
Clara, que parles del tema de l'economia, el cap d'aquest creuer és la persona, el jefe, que diguem, és un home que es diu Keith, que és com una mena de gurú estrany que parla com si fos una mena de manual d'autoajuda i que obliga els seus treballadors a fer coses terribles, horribles i molt divertides per demostrar el seu compromís amb la feina. Llavors, en aquesta novel·la crees aquesta mena de figura com quasi messiànica, en certa manera, no? I una mica la idea de la feina com a salvació per l'Ingrid, com un escapament. I et volia preguntar per això, per aquesta mena de cultura del treball que dibuixes, que és quasi religiosa, en certa manera.
Yeah, I think that idea of work as being sort of a stand-in for religion is really interesting. I was in, this is like, feels like quite a glamorous story, but I was in San Francisco the week that Uber went public, and I was really sort of struck by this feeling of like how a city tolerates the creation of a bunch of new millionaires, and I was quite like troubled by being in San Francisco. It's a really weird place. It felt very uncanny. It felt like there was a lot of kind of underlying tensions, and I started reading a lot about Silicon Valley work practices, which I became really fascinated by, and they require such a high level of devotion, and they're so candid in asking for that level of devotion, and in a way that feels like kind of they want you to sort of like sacrifice yourself at the altar of this extreme working environment. So one of the things that I was sort of fascinated about was I was reading about this particular tech company that when you're getting fired, they send you an email saying, congratulations, you've been graduated, and off to your next opportunity. And I felt like that felt quite indicative of a lot of the sort of like almost like gaslighting practices that were happening, in which you were being forced to doubt your perception of reality. And they're also quite candid in wanting you for a very short amount of time and basically sort of squeezing you dry and eking out like maximum production from you for a very short amount of time, and really requiring your job to be like the main source of richness from your life. So I was really interested in that, and the sort of blurring, and like the phrase I was coming back to was like the lifestyleification of work, and kind of how work becomes like your sort of personal brand, and you have very little room to engage with anything beyond work, and all of those things sort of creep into your work. I used to live above this like graphic design agency in Manchester, and it had a bar within the graphic design agency, and I used to like come back after a night out and there would still be people in there drinking at the bar at like 10, 11 o'clock. And I used to think like, oh, I mean, I imagine when you first see that your work has a bar, that seems really cool, but it's really dangerous. And I thought like, I was just wondering, those designers probably didn't realise how much work was sort of getting squeezed out of them, because even though they were at the bar, they were probably on their best behaviour, they weren't fully relaxed, and they were probably talking about work, and they were doing sort of that softer work of like maybe creating sort of bonds and teamwork, and it just felt sort of a way of kind of reaffirming this idea of like, this is your life, this is all there is, which felt really like really dangerous to me.
De fet, a mi com totes aquestes idees, no? Com del creuer i de l'accés i de com aquesta mena de cultura del treball excessiva també em porta com molt a la idea com de la insaciabilitat. Una miqueta com en una mena de dicotomia que crec que apareix molt en les teves novel·les entre com saturació i buidor. Per exemple, penso en The Odyssey, per exemple, que és un creuer que està absolutament ple de coses, no? Piscines, teatres, restaurants, cinemes, i en canvi la protagonista, la Ingrid, el que ella prefereix més és estar-se sola a la cabina mirant al mar i com, no? En aquest estat de buidor absolut. I a Supper Club, que és la seva novel·la anterior, també meravellosa, que està traduïda al castellà com Les devoradores a Blacky Books, també doncs, la protagonista, la Roberta, és com una noia d'una vida molt senzilla, però de tant en tant s'entrega a aquesta mena de banquets fastuosos en què un grup de dones es posen a jalar com si no hi hagués demà i una mica en un plan una mica com això, insaciable, no? I et volia preguntar per això, perquè trobo que hi ha molts paral·lels entre el tema com de situació històrica, diguem, de context històric, i aquesta insaciabilitat de les teves protagonistes, que estan com molt entre com l'estarvation, no sé, entre la buidor i aquesta mena de gana permanent.
That's such an interesting reading of it, and I hadn't thought about those two kind of those parallels. I do wonder if that is kind of a generational thing. In the UK, there's this fixation about like avocado toast, and and like millennials spend all their money on avocado toast, and that's why they can't afford mortgages. And I do think there's sort of something in it, in that I do think maybe we're more likely to splurge on these kind of moments of like micro decadence, because the big things like a mortgage and that sort of security feels very inaccessible to us. So maybe we do sort of treat ourselves to these kind of micro moments of decadence. One of the things I was thinking about when I was writing The Odyssey was I used to have this joke with my mum that me and none of my friends, which not the case anymore, like now that we're nearly 40, but me and none of my friends, like none of us had a baby, none of us were married, none of us owned a house, and none of us could even drive. And I used to say to my mum, like, name any one of my friends. You know, she'd, Alex, yep, not got a baby, not married, doesn't own a house, can't drive. Next one. And it just felt like all of these kind of big signifiers of adulthood, like we just weren't there. And that was, you know, like partially kind of material conditions, partially, I don't know, I do accept some level of responsibility. I've now been having driving lessons for 2 years and I still cannot drive. So I do think there is something in like seeking out these experiences of decadence to cope with the inaccessible hallmarks of like being a person in the world.
I ara que estem entrant ja més també en els teus personatges, et volia preguntar també per la qüestió de la ràbia femenina, que et diria que també és com molt important tant a Supper Club com a l'Odissea, perquè tot i que les dues protagonistes, la Ingrid a l'Odissea i la Roberta a Supper Club, són força diferents en molts aspectes, sí que diria que en les dues hi ha com aquesta mena de mescla com de ràbia i com de submissió i com de molta necessitat també, que em sembla com molt interessant i que de fet, o sigui, bueno, molt a favor, però et volia preguntar com vas decidir treballar aquestes dicotomies.
I'm just terrified of how accurately you're perceiving me. I feel like I'm in a therapy session, like, oh my God, yes, you're right, they are that mixture of rage and passivity. Wonder where that comes from. Yeah, I think I'm quite interested in the idea of like passive aggression, probably because I'm quite passive aggressive. I'm trying not to be, and I do think that is quite an interesting kind of point to occupy. Like I get a lot out of often with men pretending to be like stupider than I am, just to see if they'll correct me. And that's for some reason, something that springs to mind is I was wearing a T-shirt for a date once. I was obviously not making much of an effort, but it was for the musician Daniel Johnston. And when I got to the date, the date said to me, "Oh, Daniel Johnson," and I said, "Oh, who's he?" Like obviously joking, and he was like, "Oh, he's like a musician. He's like quite an experimental musician." And I was like, I know. that was the joke. So I do think maybe I personally have that impulse, and that's maybe how it's kind of coming through in my characters. I am interested in writing about female anger because it feels like such a non-permissible state, and generally I think I'm interested in writing about non-permissible ways of being a woman, maybe just vicariously, for me to kind of be able to exist in those capacities for a little while. I like to write kind of unlikable characters, and I generally end up liking them at the end, but I also think I'm interested in. I feel like there's a lot of talk at the moment about this idea of like the unlikable female character as kind of having a moment, and I think we've got hundreds of years of like unlikable male characters, and
unlikable female characters badly.
Yeah. So I think I don't know. I feel like long may that continue. Unlikable women.
I en aquest sentit, creus també que potser l'escriptura és com... És un espai on pots fer coses o fer coses que potser no pots fer a la vida real degut als protocols de la vida civilitzada. I que potser com aquests personatges femenins ambigus o no tan agradables també tenen aquest element catàrtic, entenc que sí, però bueno.
Maybe. One of the things that I was thinking about in that question is I'm quite interested in like how I as a writer take up room on the page. So something that from Supper Club rather than from the Odyssey. One of the things I did in Supper Club was I had these kind of they weren't quite recipes. They were sort of like more ruminations on recipes, or these sort of like embodied descriptions of following a recipe. And I quite like the idea that there was something a little bit tedious about making the reader read through this kind of like experimental like flourish that I was writing through, and it felt like an interesting way for me as like a female writer to sort of take up space with this kind of I don't know, sort of experimental or symbolic experiment on the page, and I felt like that was an opportunity to sort of take up space in a way that I probably wouldn't feel comfortable doing in real life. Like I'm just going to really put you through your paces with this. Like, I don't know, one of my favourite writers is David Foster Wallace, and I really like the way that he will sort of force you to read some really boring, dense prose for a little bit until you get to the good stuff. And I kind of admire that about him, and I guess that was my way of sort of doing that a much smaller level, probably not trying to take up too much space. Yeah.
I d'altra banda també tornant a l'Odissea, la Ingrid és un personatge que sovint sembla com que vulgui desaparèixer, no? En certa manera. I això em semblava com curiós perquè ara també estem en una època, diria, en què hi ha moltes narratives d'afirmació del jo, i en canvi sembla això, que la Ingrid el que vulgui sigui desaparèixer del mapa, no? Voldria no tenir cos, no tenir desitjos, preferiria no tenir com res de res. I això em feia pensar que en una època com molt marcada per aquesta mena d'obligació de ser algú, no? Com de tenir una identitat com molt clara, em semblava una posició com molt interessant sobre el tema de la identitat, i volia preguntar-te si creies que tenia a veure com amb això, amb aquest context potser com de molta afirmació del jo. No sé si m'he explicat gaire bé, però...
I think that's really present, and that's definitely something that I relate to. I think one of the themes that I'm interested in my writing in general is this kind of like will towards oblivion, or kind of like self-annihilation through different modes. So I guess in Supper Club, she kind of is eating herself into a kind of point of annihilation. And in The Odyssey, Ingrid is sort of working herself to a point of annihilation. And I was even thinking today, I was walking a lot around Parma today, and I was thinking about how I love walking, and I would just walk and walk to the point that I almost want to cease to exist. Like I want to walk and then walk myself until I almost just dissolve into like non-matter. So I definitely get that sort of will to, I don't know, a sort of like disembodied will, but also a kind of will towards obliteration and annihilation. And I do think maybe that is sort of, I wonder if that is kind of, I mean, again, this is probably like one for my therapist's couch. It's like really unpacking my high death drive. Like creaking open Freud. So I think that's, again, probably me coming out. But maybe that does sort of stand in opposition towards like the sort of self-branding of the self and kind of, I don't know if that's a good answer.
D'altra banda, tant en l'Odissea com en Supper Club et situes com en el realisme, no? Però també com planteges situacions com grotesques, exagerades i en molts moments com fins i tot com fantasioses, no? Com molt de descontrol, molt divertit. Llavors et volia preguntar com utilitzes aquest element grotesc en les teves històries, i és perquè també vivim en una societat que, si te la mires de prop, és profundament grotesca. I tu exageres més com en l'edició o quan comences a escriure ja estàs com a mil revolucions?
I do have a fascination with gross things. I do love gross things. I have been writing a Substack about my preoccupation with gross things. So when I was pregnant, one of the things I was excited about was getting to see my placenta and like being able to bring it home. And I was so excited to be able to bring home my placenta. Because I do have this weird fixation on like grossness and like bodily things. I don't know why I'm bringing this up now. But my partner had to bring it home in this Tupperware container, and he left it in the fridge until I got home, and then I just emptied it into the sink and I just like prodded it for a bit. And I was like, I've gotten something out of this. This will come up in my writing at some point. So I do think I generally have, and then he made me put it in the outside bin. But yeah, enough. Let's go in the bin. So I do think I have this sort of will towards gross things, and I'm kind of interested in sort of gross bodily things in my writing, to the point that I almost can't help it. It will just come out. One of my friends recently said, "Oh, you know, it's a Lara Williams book if there's vomiting in it," and I hadn't even made that connection. I was like, yeah, I guess there is quite a lot of vomiting in my writing. So yeah, I'm generally interested in abjection. I feel abjected quite frequently. I remember there was a study done a while ago that showed that the more inclined you are towards feelings of disgust, the more right wing you're likely to be. And I did the test to see kind of where you fall on the scale of like how sensitive you are to feelings of disgust, and I was very sensitive to it, and which really like worried me. I was like, oh my god. So I think I am quite sensitive to feelings of disgust, but I am kind of fixated on it, and I think there's something kind of interesting, and I guess there's a kind of like rich female tradition of writing gross things, which I'm happily a part of.
Clar que sí, molt a favor, molt a favor. Bé, ja per acabar també et volia preguntar una mica com pel que seria com el procés d'escriptura de les teves novel·les. No sé si és diferent en cada ocasió, però si quan escrius ja de bon principi tens claríssim per on anirà la novel·la, si comences a escriure i vas provant, si ets una escriptora com molt ordenada o si hi ha com una metodologia o si vas veient una mica intuïtivament, que suposo que...
I think, as I was saying before, I feel like I'm quite instinctive in that I will often have like a few ideas and I'm not sure how those ideas connect to each other, but I feel very strongly that they all belong in the same world. And often my writing process is just figuring out why those collection of ideas all belong in the same book. I think I generally have an idea of kind of the key moments or the key dramatic beats that I want to hit, but I don't know what's going to happen between them. So I'm not a very good planner. So I usually have a sense of where it's going to go on an extremely broad canvas, and then I'm figuring out how to kind of arrive at those moments sort of through writing it.
But do you think it makes it more exciting to not know?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it does, and I also like the fact that maybe some of those kind of plot moments or narrative moments might be informed by how I feel on a particular day. One of the kind of not techniques, but one of the things that I do if I'm trying to hit a deadline or something is just wake up every day and just feel how many words I think I can manage and then try and hit that. So like maybe today's like a 500 word day, and or maybe today's maybe 150 words today.
Bé, i ara crec que és potser un moment de... No sé si algú té alguna pregunta. Sí. En qualsevol cas, les seves novel·les són meravelloses, les heu de llegir. És una escriptora molt astuta i amb molt d'orgull pel que passa pel món. Però això no sé si teniu alguna pregunta.
Bé, jo és que vos hauria escoltat, o sigui, ara m'agradaria que no callássiu mai, perquè ha estat interessantíssim. Crec que xerren en nom de tots, però de veres ha estat superconstructiu i nutritiu i interessant, i alhora molt divertit escoltar-vos, perquè se nota que heu reflexionat molt les dues, no? Per cada banda, tu sobre la seva obra, però també sobre coses que t'afecten, i sentir dues persones joves que tenen el cap ben amoblat i que ho saben expressar, la veritat és que ha estat un gust. En tot cas, gràcies, Alexa, i per acabar, sempre acabam, jo deia al principi, fem una pregunta inicial i una pregunta final, que sempre és la mateixa, i la final és que, com que estem fent aquesta màtria entre totes les dones que passen per aquestes converses de Mallorca Literària, vos demanam que afegiu el nom d'una dona, autora, traductora, editora, cineasta, qualsevol dona vinculada amb la vostra obra, amb el fet de llegir, amb el fet de viure, que vos inspiri d'alguna manera, abans que digueu la vostra, però vos llegiré les que ja duim, que a més també serveix fer aquest repàs, jo ja quasi me'ls sé a memòria, dic quasi perquè és llarguet, però que també sempre hi ha qualque nom que no coneixes i tal vegada te ven al cap i dius m'interessa. Fins ara s'ha xerrat de Anne Carson, Cynthia Ozick, Mary Wollstonecraft, Eider Rodríguez, na Carla Simón, na Rachel Cusk, na Sílvia Plath, na Emily Dickinson, na Raquel Ricard, na Mercè Rodoreda, na Mary Torres, Neva Piqué, Simone Weil, Natalia Carrero, Marta Carnicero, Olga Raun, Patricia Highsmith, Adrienne Rich, jo dic que m'ho sabia de memòria i no era cert, Patricia Highsmith, Adrienne Rich, Lina Meruane, Samantha Schweblin, Ellen Sisou, Denise Desotel i Bernardine Evaristo. Va ser la darrera que se va afegir. Si n'hi ha alguna que vos vengui, si en voleu dir dues, de vegades també ho permetem, quin nom de quina dona que vos hagi inspirat i que vos motivi, afegiríeu en aquesta llista.
No cal que sigui escriptora. Doncs jo afegiria la Georgia O'Keeffe, que m'agrada molt que estigués allà per les planúries de Texas fent lo seu i passant de tothom, i m'agraden molt les seves pintures. Sí.
I pega molt en la conversa, no? Aquest món seu.
Sí. És una mica l'última obsessió que tinc.
Nice. I was going to say Patricia Highsmith, just because I've been reading her book about writing recently, and I really like how uncompromising she is, but obviously she's not on the list. So somebody that I feel like is sort of adjacent to her that I'm going to add is Flannery O'Connor, which I think sort of fits the conversation in that she's really uncompromising. She doesn't care if she's liked or not. She's kind of a misanthropic, which I feel like is a kind of way that it feels very impermissible to be as a woman, is to assume the position of essentially not liking other people. But I really, I think she's a wonderful writer, and I think she's a very interesting person.
Quines dues dones, Flannery O'Connor i Josie O'Keeffe, per afegir en aquesta conversa. Només mos queda emplaçar-vos a la pròxima cita de Màtries, que serà dia 21 de maig a la llibreria Drac Màgic, en Valeria Carrela i en Sara Serrano, traductora, autora de l'Espai Blanc, la primera, i donar-vos les gràcies a Alexa, gràcies Lara Williams i gràcies Irene Pujadas per aquesta conversa que ha estat un goig. Moltíssimes gràcies.
Thank you so much.
Sí, nosaltres aquí, per l'exàrcit.
Jo no sé què més preguntar. Ara, l'altre dia ahir parlàvem amb la Lara de la diferència entre escriure contes i escriure novel·les, perquè ella va començar escrivint contes i ara escriu novel·les. I jo estic intentant escriure una novel·la. I m'està semblant com una cosa extremament diferent del que és el procés d'escriure contes, en què per mi tot era com bastant intuïtiu al principi i llavors després feia com molta edició i ho concretava tot molt i llavors em centrava molt en el conte que volia fer, però al principi realment era molt màgic, en el sentit de no saber gaire cap a on vas. I ahir parlàvem sobre el fet que això en una novel·la entenc que no es pot fer perquè és un desastre. I llavors estic bregant amb aquest nou tema del procés de fer una cosa més llarga.
I remember when I first finished a draft of Supper Club after writing short stories, I had this feeling of this is what it must be like to run a marathon, in that that was horrible, I want to do it again. And that is how I feel at the end of when I finished a novel, like, God, that was awful, I can't wait for the next one.
It's like never drink again.
I mean, it's not like that. Definitely. Yeah.
T'agrada més escriure contes o novel·les o creus que són coses molt diferents a l'hora d'escriure?
I think there's something about writing a short story that gives you this kind of quick dopamine fix, and there's something so pleasing about writing a short story because you have so much control of it, and you can sort of step back and look at it as this kind of complete object, and you know where every comma is, and I just feel like if you've kind of got a will to control, it's so satisfying in a way that I think a novel there's room for more error, and I feel like when I look at my novels I can mostly see the errors, whereas in my short stories I usually feel very like I've absolutely like finessed this to within an inch of its life, in a way that I don't think you're able to with a novel.
Perquè tu després amb les novel·les, jo si estem així vaig preguntant, ja em parareu. Sí, edites molt, perquè també em dóna la sensació que tant amb Supper Club, que el tinc com mega subratllat, com amb The Odyssey, tens com molt domini de la frase. O sigui, hi ha com frases que estan com molt ben fetes. I llavors et volia preguntar com si edites molt, com després d'un primer esborrany, edites molt a nivell d'això, d'una mica com de la bellesa de les frases o no?
I am dementedly editing myself. Yeah, very much. I always think one of my favourite writers is the short story writer Laurie Moore, and I remember reading a review of her in which the reviewer said she edits with so much pain in her face, and you can feel the pain in her face as you read her sentences, and I feel like that's me. Like I'm editing with so much pain in my face. So yeah, I think, yeah, and I do obsessively and intensely think about everything that I'm writing, to the point that when it's gone, I'm like, oh God, what do I do with all this negative space?
I pel que fa al que dius del dolor, que gaudeixes més? El que seria com el primer esborrany, en el sentit de crear una història, o la part de l'edició en què ja tens la història creada, llavors estàs com més com treballant allò, les frases, els símbols, el tal...
Definitely editing. I feel like editing is like the prize that you win after. How about you?
I think it's the same. Like, sí, per mi la primera part, la part com de crear, vaig com molt més perduda i després tinc més sensació de saber cap a on van els tiros una mica.
Yeah, and you've done all of that thinking, and then you just get to think about how to make the sentences lovely.
Beautiful. How should we make this beautiful? Ja estem. Perdó. Pues moltíssimes gràcies a la Fundació Mallorca Literària i a Rata Corners per haver-nos convidat i ja està. Moltes gràcies per venir. Vosaltres.
Thank you so much for interviewing me, and thank you so much for having me and translating. Thank you.